The first indication that the sanctuary Alex had painstakingly constructed for his son had been breached was not a sound, but the horrifying absence of it, followed by a maelstrom. Jamie, his 7-year-old boy, a child whose world was a symphony of heightened, often overwhelming sensations, was in his calm-down corner, a softly lit nook in their living room. He'd had a challenging morning, the unexpected blare of a neighbor's car alarm having thrown his delicate sensory equilibrium into disarray. Alex had gently guided him to the corner, placing the specially designed high-fidelity headphones over his ears. Jamie usually visibly relaxed within moments of his curated playlist, a gentle soundscape of binaural beats, soft classical piano, and the rhythmic lapping of ocean waves, beginning to play. Today, however, as Alex cued the familiar track on the tablet, connected via Bluetooth, Jamie's small body, instead of unclenching, went rigid. His eyes, usually the soft blue of a summer sky, widened in sheer, uncomprehending terror. He tore the headphones off his hands, flying to cover his ears, and then erupted into a full-blown autistic meltdown, a terrifying vortex of shrill wordless screams, frantic rocking, and self-injurious behavior as he began to strike his head with his fists. Confused and alarmed, Alex snatched up the headphones, intending to check the connection, his ears still ringing from Jamie's cries. As he slipped them on, expecting the soothing lull of Debussy, he was instead assaulted by a brutal, deafening barrage of sound. Automatic gunfire, close range, punctuated by the sickening, realistic thuds of impacts and distorted, panicked shouts. It was raw, terrifying, a soundscape lifted directly from a war zone or a first-person shooter game. His blood ran cold. This wasn't a glitch. This was a deliberate, malicious act. Someone had hacked into his son's therapeutic lifeline, his auditory sanctuary, and replaced peace with the auditory equivalent of shrapnel. The question of how was momentarily eclipsed by the more horrifying who, and the chilling realization that someone in their quiet suburban neighborhood was capable of such calculated, insidious cruelty. Alex, a senior cyber audio analyst for the city's police department, felt a familiar professional calm descend a cold, hard layer over the raging inferno of paternal fury. This wasn't just a personal attack. This was a crime, a sophisticated digital assault, and he had the unique skills to unmask its perpetrator. The move to Serene Meadows 6 months earlier had been a carefully orchestrated quest for peace, a deliberate step away from the auditory chaos of their previous city apartment. Alex and his wife, Sarah, a compassionate pediatric occupational therapist, had chosen the sprawling, tree-lined development specifically for Jamie. Jamie, their bright, inquisitive, and deeply sensitive son, lived with autism spectrum disorder level 2. For him, the everyday world was a relentless barrage of sensory input. Sounds were amplified, lights were blinding, textures could be agonizing. His auditory sensitivities were particularly acute. Unexpected loud noises, certain frequencies, even the overlapping chatter of a crowded room could trigger profound distress, anxiety, and if unmanaged, a debilitating meltdown. His carefully curated playlists, delivered through noise-isolating headphones, were not a luxury or a pastime. They were an essential therapeutic tool, a way for him to modulate the overwhelming sonic landscape, to find a pocket of calm in which he could regulate his nervous system, focus, learn, and simply exist without constant pain. Alex, whose professional life was spent in the digital trenches, sifting through terabytes of audio data, enhancing covert recordings, analyzing voice stress patterns and criminal interrogations, and tracing the digital footprints of cyberstalkers and online predators, understood the power of sound both to heal and to harm more intimately than most. He had built a digital fortress around Jamie's auditory world, or so he had thought. The first discordant note in their new neighborhood symphony had been struck by Mrs. Agnes Gable, the self-appointed grande dame of the Serene Meadows Homeowners Association, a woman whose perfectly coiffed silver hair and perpetually pursed lips seemed to telegraph a constant state of disapproval. Her initial comments had been subtle, delivered with a thin, saccharine smile that didn't quite reach her cold, appraising eyes. She'd cornered Alex at a community meet and greet, her gaze lingering on Jamie, who was happily listening to his Nature Sounds playlist through his distinctive blue headphones, gently rocking as he watched a line of ants. "Mr. Thompson," she'd begun her voice a carefully modulated contralto, "your son is rather quiet, isn't he, always with those ear coverings?" Does he ever, interact with the real world? It's so important for children to be present to engage. Yeah, Alex had explained patiently and politely about Jamie's autism and his auditory sensitivities, about how the headphones and music helped him manage the overwhelming environment so he could engage. They're not to shut the world out, Mrs. Gable, he'd clarified. They're to help him filter it, to make it less painful. Mrs. Gable had made a small, unconvinced humph sound. Well, in my day, children learned to adapt. A little less coddling, a little more discipline, that's what was needed. This modern trend of accommodating every little sensitivity, it doesn't prepare them for reality, does it? That was the inciting incident, the first clear signal that Mrs. Gable's worldview was diametrically opposed to everything Alex and Sarah understood about their son's needs. Her pronouncements, cloaked in the guise of old-fashioned common sense, dripped with an ignorance and intolerance that set Alex's internal alarms ringing. He recognized the type, the individual who believed their personal opinions and limited understanding trumped medical science professional expertise and basic human empathy. The rising action of Mrs. Gable's interference was a campaign of escalating passive aggression and overt complaints primarily focused on Jamie's auditory world. The first notable incident occurred a few weeks later. Jamie had a habit of vocal stimming when he was excited or trying to process complex information, a series of soft, repetitive humming or chirping sounds. He was doing this in their own backyard, a joyful sound to Alex and Sarah, as he examined a ladybug on a rosebush. Mrs. Gable, whose property abutted theirs, appeared at the low dividing fence, her face a mask of affront. "Mr. Thompson," she'd called out, her voice sharp enough to make Jamie flinch and fall silent. "Could you please ask your son to cease those peculiar noises? It's quite distracting. I'm trying to enjoy a cup of tea on my patio, and it's rather like listening to a trapped bird." Alex had walked over to the fence, his jaw tight. "Mrs. Gable, Jamie is autistic. That peculiar noise, as you call it, is a vocal stim. It's a harmless way for him to self-regulate and express his engagement. He is on his own property, and his sounds are not excessively loud." "Autistic or not," Mrs. Gable had retorted, her eyes narrowing, "there are community standards of peace and quiet. We all have a right to enjoy our properties without constant strange disruptions. Perhaps if his music through those headphones wasn't always some repetitive drone, he wouldn't feel the need to make such noises himself." The implication that his carefully chosen therapeutic music was somehow inadequate or to blame was a low blow. The second incident was more direct, an attempt to curtail Jamie's access to his auditory sanctuary. The Serene Meadows HOA had a small, rarely used community room with a few tables and a collection of donated books. Alex and Sarah had occasionally taken Jamie there on rainy afternoons, allowing him to listen to his calming music at a very low volume through a small portable Bluetooth speaker while he looked at picture books, as he sometimes found wearing headphones for extended periods uncomfortable. Mrs. Gable, who seemed to possess an uncanny ability to materialize wherever she perceived an infraction of her unwritten rules, had entered the community room during one such visit. "This is a library, a quiet space," she'd announced, her voice resonating with disapproval, though they were the only occupants. "That noise is entirely inappropriate." She gestured towards the small speaker from which a barely audible track of gentle rainfall and wind chimes was playing. "Mrs. Gable." Sarah had intervened this time, her voice calm but firm. "This is therapeutic ambient sound for Jamie. It's at a very low volume, and it helps him focus and remain calm. We are the only ones here." Be that as it may. Mrs. Gable had sniffed. Rules are rules, and the pervasive use of these electronic devices and their associated noises is eroding common courtesy. If he cannot be quiet without artificial aids, perhaps a public community space is not suitable for him. She then made a show of pointedly selecting a magazine and sitting as far away from them as possible, radiating an aura of martyrdom. Her attempt to shame them to make Jamie feel unwelcome, even in a virtually empty room, was a clear escalation of her hostility. Alex began to meticulously document every interaction, every complaint, a grim habit from his professional life that now felt like an essential shield for his family. He also upgraded their home Wi-Fi security, installing a more robust firewall and changing all default passwords, a nagging unease prompting him to be extra cautious, though he couldn't yet articulate a specific digital threat. The midpoint twist, the discovery that recontextualized Mrs. Gable's animosity and hinted at a more insidious, ideologically driven motive, came through Alex's professional channels, albeit indirectly. He was attending a regional cybercrime conference, and one of the breakout sessions focused on the rise of online hate groups and extremist ideologies, targeting vulnerable populations, including individuals with disabilities. The presenter, a respected academic, mentioned several pseudoscientific parenting and behavioral modification groups that had gained traction on obscure forums and social media platforms. These groups often promoted harsh, outdated, and sometimes abusive therapies for autistic children, decrying accepted interventions like sensory supports and communication aids as coddling or enabling dysfunction. They advocated for aggressive desensitization techniques, exposing children to overwhelming stimuli to toughen them up or force them to adapt. A chill snaked down Alex's spine. Mrs. Gable's earlier comments about coddling, discipline, and adapting to the real world echoed some of the rhetoric described. On a hunch, using his off-duty time and his advanced open-source intelligence OSINT skills, Alex began to explore some of the darker corners of these online communities. It took several days of careful anonymous searching, but he eventually found her. Agnes Gable, under a slightly altered name, but with a profile picture that was unmistakably her, was an active participant in a private online forum called Restorative Parenting for a Resilient Generation. The forum was a cesspool of misinformation and prejudice, filled with posts railing against the autism epidemic, attacking neurodiversity advocates, and promoting assertive behavioral conditioning. Mrs. Gable's posts were particularly venomous. She wrote about the tyranny of special needs, the failure of modern parents to instill proper discipline, and most chillingly, she shared an article that argued that sensory sensitivities in autistic children were learned helplessness, and that therapeutic soundscapes were crutches that prevented true neurological adaptation. The article advocated for controlled exposure to challenging auditory stimuli to break the cycle of dependency. Alex felt physically ill. Mrs. Gable wasn't just an ignorant, intolerant busybody. She was an ideologue, a believer in a harmful pseudoscientific doctrine that actively promoted causing distress to autistic children under the guise of helping them. Her pronouncements about Jamie weren't just random acts of neighborhood unpleasantness. They were rooted in a dangerous extremist belief system. Her attempts to criticize Jamie's music, his stims, his headphones, they were all part of her twisted worldview. And now, with the discovery of the sabotaged playlist, Alex realized with dawning horror that Mrs. Gable might have decided to take her restorative parenting theories from the realm of online ranting into horrific real-world application, using his son as her unwilling subject. The thought that she might have deliberately weaponized sound against Jamie, knowing his vulnerabilities, was almost too monstrous to comprehend. His earlier unease about digital security now felt terrifyingly prescient. The aftermath of the Gunfire audio assault was chaotic and deeply distressing. Jamie, utterly overwhelmed and terrified, took hours to calm down, even with Sarah's expert co-regulation techniques and Alex's frantic attempts to find an uncorrupted, safe audio source. The carefully constructed piece of their home had been shattered. As soon as Jamie was finally asleep, exhausted, and whimpering in Sarah's arms, Alex went into professional mode. This was no longer a neighborhood dispute. This was a sophisticated, malicious digital attack, a clear instance of psychological abuse and harassment, and it had targeted a vulnerable child. He meticulously secured Jamie's tablet and the Bluetooth speaker. First, he created a forensic image of the tablet's memory to preserve the data in its current state. Then, he began his analysis. The compromised playlist, usually titled Jamie's Calm Seas, was still there, but when he examined the metadata of the tracks, he found an anomaly. The final track, the one that had played the Gunfire, had a different file extension, a different creation date, and crucially, its properties revealed it had been added to the playlist from a different source device than all the others, which Alex had personally curated from his own secure music library. This new file was a high bitrate MP3, crudely titled Real World Sounds MP3. Its length was exactly 3 minutes, a relentless barrage of automatic weapon fire explosions and screams. His next step was to analyze their home network logs. He had, as a precaution after Mrs. Gable's earlier escalations, implemented enhanced logging on their router. He cross-referenced the timestamp of the file modification on Jamie's tablet with the router's access logs. His blood ran cold. At approximately 2:17 a.m. the previous night, while they were all asleep, there had been an unauthorized connection to their Wi-Fi network. The connection was brief, lasting only about 5 minutes, but it was from an unrecognized MAC address, the unique hardware identifier of a network interface card. The intruder had likely used a brute force attack on their previously simpler Wi-Fi password, or exploited a momentary lapse when Alex had briefly reverted to a less complex password during a router reset days earlier, a lapse he now cursed himself for. During that 5-minute window, data had been transferred to Jamie's tablet, which, like many such devices, was set to automatically sync playlists across their home network. The critical piece of the puzzle was tracing that rogue MAC address, or ideally the IP address, associated with the upload if the file had been downloaded from the internet and then transferred. The MP3 file itself, Real World Sounds, MP3, was generic enough that a direct online source trace would be difficult. However, the MAC address of the connecting device was a solid lead. While MAC addresses can be spoofed, it's less common in opportunistic amateur attacks. He ran the MAC address through a vendor lookup tool. It corresponded to a popular brand of older budget laptop. Not definitive, but a piece of the puzzle. The real breakthrough came when he analyzed the metadata embedded within the MP3 file itself. Buried deep within the non-audio data chunks of the file, he found a faint digital fingerprint. The audio editing software used to create, or more likely to clip, and save this specific version of the Gunfire track had left a nearly invisible marker, a user ID from a trial version of a shareware audio program. The user ID was Agable77, Agnes Gable. The 77 was likely a birth year or a favorite number. It was circumstantial, but combined with the Wi-Fi intrusion from a device on their local network, her known animosity, her extremist online beliefs, and her proximity, it was rapidly forming a compelling case. To confirm the local network breach, Alex knew he needed to pinpoint the physical location of the device that had connected. Given the likely amateur nature of the intrusion, the attacker probably hadn't used sophisticated anonymizing techniques for a local Wi-Fi hack. He cross-referenced the signal strength logs from his router during the intrusion. The signal from the rogue device was strong, very strong, indicating it was extremely close, likely within one of the immediately adjacent properties. Mrs. Gable's house was directly next door, sharing a short property line. Alex felt a grim satisfaction. He had her, or at least he had the digital breadcrumbs that led directly to her. He spent the rest of the night meticulously compiling his findings into a detailed forensic report, complete with screenshots, log files, and a technical analysis that would be irrefutable in court. He was acting now not just as a father, but as the seasoned cyber audio investigator he was. The next morning, after a sleepless night for both him and Sarah, and after ensuring Jamie was calm and engaged in a quiet activity, far from any electronic devices, Alex made the call to his own department. He outlined the situation to his supervising lieutenant, emphasizing the targeted nature of the attack, the victim's vulnerability as an autistic child, and the preliminary digital evidence he had already uncovered. Given the unique circumstances, a digital assault involving psychological abuse of a minor perpetrated by a neighbor, with Alex himself being both the victim's parent and the primary forensic investigator, it was decided that while Alex would provide all his forensic findings, the official investigation and subsequent arrest would be handled by a trusted colleague from his unit, Detective Miller, to maintain procedural integrity and avoid any appearance of a conflict of interest, though Alex would be present as the complainant and an expert witness. Detective Miller, a sharp, no-nonsense cybercrime veteran whom Alex had worked with on numerous complex cases, arrived at their home late that morning. Alex walked him through the evidence, the network logs, the metadata analysis, the profile of Mrs. Gable and her extremist online activities. Miller listened intently, his expression growing increasingly grim. "This is monstrous, Alex," Miller said, shaking his head. "To weaponize a child's therapy like this, it's a new low, even for the cases we see." With a warrant secured based on Alex's detailed affidavit and forensic report, Detective Miller, accompanied by 2 uniformed officers, proceeded to Mrs. Gable's residence. Alex and Sarah watched from their window, their hearts pounding. They saw Miller knock, saw Mrs. Gable open the door, her expression one of surprised, feigned affability. They saw that affability crumble as Miller identified himself and presented the warrant. The subsequent search of Mrs. Gable's home, as Alex later learned from Miller, yielded the crucial corroborating evidence. On an old laptop found in her study, forensic analysts discovered the trial version of the audio editing software with the user ID agable77. They found remnants of the real-world sounds.mp3 file in the computer's temporary internet files and recycle bin. And most damningly, the laptop's network connection history showed a successful connection to Alex's Wi-Fi network at precisely 2:17 a.m. on the night of the intrusion, with the laptop's MAC address matching the one Alex had logged. When confronted with the irrefutable digital evidence, Mrs. Gable's composure finally spectacularly shattered. Her initial denials gave way to a rambling, self-pitying justification echoing the twisted ideology Alex had found in her online forum posts. She claimed she was only trying to help Jamie, to desensitize him to the harsh realities of the world, that his therapeutic music was coddling him, and that a little exposure to real-world sounds would build his resilience. She seemed genuinely to believe her cruel act of sabotage was a form of tough love therapy, a misguided DIY attempt at an aggressive behavioral intervention she'd read about on her extremist forums. She showed no remorse for the terror she had inflicted on Jamie, only indignation that her efforts were being misconstrued as malicious. Detective Miller arrested Agnes Gable on charges of felony digital harassment of a minor intentional infliction of emotional distress, unauthorized access to a computer system, and psychological abuse of a vulnerable individual. As she was led protesting her innocence and her good intentions to the waiting police car, Alex felt not a sense of triumph, but a profound, weary sadness and a cold, hard anger at the insidious nature of the ignorance and prejudice that had driven her to such a despicable act. The legal proceedings against Agnes Gable were complex, navigating the relatively new and evolving landscape of cyber harassment and psychological abuse charges, especially involving a child with autism. Alex's meticulous forensic work, however, formed the unshakable bedrock of the prosecution's case. His expert testimony explaining the digital trail, the compromised network, the metadata analysis, and the irrefutable link between Mrs. Gable's laptop and the altered playlist was crucial. Sarah provided powerful victim impact testimony, describing Jamie's profound distress, the violation of his sanctuary, and the long-term emotional and developmental setbacks caused by the auditory assault. Jamie's therapist also testified to the critical importance of his therapeutic music and the severe psychological harm inflicted by its malicious replacement with traumatic sounds. The community of Serene Meadows was horrified and ashamed by the revelations. Many neighbors who had previously dismissed Mrs. Gable as merely an eccentric or overly critical busybody now saw the true depth of her malice and the dangerous nature of her misguided beliefs. There was an outpouring of support for Alex's family. The HOA board, deeply embarrassed, issued a formal apology and initiated a review of its community conduct policies, including provisions for addressing harassment and promoting inclusivity. They also sponsored a series of workshops on autism awareness and neurodiversity for residents. Agnes Gable was found guilty on multiple counts. Given the severity of the psychological trauma inflicted on a vulnerable child and the calculated, insidious nature of the digital crime, the judge sentenced her to a significant period of probation contingent on her successfully completing intensive psychological counseling and a comprehensive course on disability awareness and ethical online conduct. She was also ordered to pay substantial restitution to Alex's family to cover the costs of Jamie's ongoing therapy and the replacement of his compromised electronic devices. A permanent restraining order was put in place, prohibiting her from any contact with Jamie or his family and from residing in Serene Meadows. Her house was put up for sale shortly thereafter. For Jamie, the journey of recovery was slow and arduous. He developed a fear of his headphones, of his tablet, of any sound he couldn't immediately identify. Loud noises once again sent him into spirals of anxiety. But with the patient, unwavering love of Alex and Sarah, the skilled intervention of his therapists, and the unexpected kindness and understanding shown by many in their now awakened community, he gradually began to heal. They worked together to create new, even more secure auditory sanctuaries for him using closed-loop systems and non-networked devices for his therapeutic music. He slowly started to trust sound again, his innate curiosity and joy eventually beginning to outweigh his fear. Alex, watching Jamie months later, cautiously placing his new, specially protected headphones over his ears, and a small, tentative smile gracing his lips as a truly calming melody began to play, felt a measure of peace return. The incident had been a terrifying intrusion, a violation of their deepest sanctums, both physical and digital. But it had also reinforced the profound importance of his work, the critical need to fight against the shadows that lurked not just in the dark alleys of the internet, but sometimes right next door, cloaked in the guise of neighborly concern. Justice had been served not just through the conviction of Agnes Gable, but in the slow, courageous reclaiming of Jamie's auditory world, and in a community's awakening to the vital truth that true harmony is built not on enforced conformity, but on understanding, acceptance, and the vigilant protection of its most vulnerable members.